The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and honored to be here in the House today to ask a question that I initially asked back in June again about inflation. And you'll notice that inflation has not abated as much as the government thinks it would have. In June, we were actually at 7.7%, and the latest number is 6.9%. So if you think we're moving down, we're still sticking around that 7%. But one thing about inflation in Canada, where the government trumpets that it's less than the rest of the world, it's because of the way we measure inflation in Canada versus the rest of the world. And I'll ask Canadians, I'll ask my colleagues on the other side of the House if they actually believe inflation is less here than elsewhere and why they think that would be. Well, the answer is because we measure it differently. We don't count as much for housing in Canada. We use a thing called owner equivalent rent, which has consistently over 30 years underestimated what the inflationary effects of housing are in Canada. But 7.7%, and it continues to go up, 6.9% now. The minister wants to drop taxes on fuel. We hope the minister will drop taxes on fuel. I know a lot of the members in this House say that the issue around petroleum is that the actual companies that produce petroleum are earning excess profits. Well, they're earning profits for the first time in 7 years because the commodity's actually gone up in price. But the last time the commodity cost this much on world markets, gas in my province was worth $1.40 a litre. Now it's worth $2.10 a litre. So there is a disconnect here. Where's that extra 70 cents per litre, that extra 50% uptick in gas? And I'll answer right now, it is, of course, on the extra taxes and the extra regulatory costs that this government has imposed upon Canadians in order to get the fuel they need to actually get to work, to actually fuel their homes and actually get things done, because energy is essential to getting everything done in Canada, especially our food. Now, 7 years ago was a long time, but Canadians need to ask, why are things getting so much more expensive when the actual cost of them in the world market is the same as it was 7 years ago? Again, taxes, 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 taxes. Now, these are inflationary effects, and I know this government has a number of taxation measures that it builds into gasoline now, which includes the clean fuel standard. The new clean electricity standard is going to actually add more cost for Canadians. But the big one here, of course, is the carbon tax. 7 years ago, what was the carbon tax? Well, I'll tell you, zero. Then it went to $20 a ton. In the last election in 2019, pardon me, the second last election, Madam Speaker, it was, the Prime Minister said we weren't going to increase it past $20 a ton, and then immediately moved it to $50 a ton, and it's going to move up to $170 a ton. But this won't be inflationary, of course. Well, let me give a quick education here. Inflationary taxes are designed to be inflationary. They raise the cost of everything, and that means that things are going to go up in price and consumers are going to feel it, no matter what this government says. I know they'll say, we give a whole bunch of it back to Canadians anyway. You give a little bit of it back. Yes, there are some Canadians that actually get some of the money they spend back. And think about that churn and burn the government goes through in order to this. Well, let me ask the government to actually think about this and you know, and I'm going to preempt my respondent here, Madam Speaker, to get past the double think that'll be part of his notes here and saying that we can have our cake and eat it too, because I heard the minister say that in the House here the other day again, that we're going to actually raise taxes on all things Canadians consume and we won't make it financially punitive to Canadians. That is hogwash, absolute hogwash. When you're going to increase the taxes on Canadians, you're going to make things inflationary. Things are going to go up in price, and therefore you're causing a problem where they're going to pay more for everything they have to buy in Canada, and that is a fact. You can't get over it. Madam Speaker, I've got a lot more to say on inflation, but I know my time is out, and I know my colleague across the way has some kind of response to give to me on this, so thank you very much.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I take a lot of time writing my notes, but to get off of it for a second at the request of my colleague, there was, in fact, a carbon price 7 years ago, just not in his home province of Alberta, but in my home province in BC, there absolutely was a price on carbon. And guess what? During that period, British Columbia had the fastest growing economy in the country at the same time that we had a carbon price. So just some food for thought before I get into my extensive notes. Our government understands, Madam Speaker, that many Canadians are worried about our country's economy and that we are facing a global slowdown due to global challenges of high inflation and higher interest rates. However, it is important to remember that inflation is in fact a global phenomenon. Indeed, it is a lingering result of the COVID pandemic, Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, and the snarled supply chains that are affecting so many people and businesses right around the world. The good news, though, Madam Speaker, is that there is no country better placed than Canada to weather the coming global economic slowdown and thrive in the years ahead. Canada's inflation rate is less severe at 6.9% than that of our peers, like the United States at 7.7, the United Kingdom at 11.1, and Germany at 10.4, and we'll rely on Stats Canada to do those calculations. Also, our country has a AAA credit rating and has the strongest economic growth in the G7 so far this year. That's alongside the lowest deficit and net debt to GDP ratios in the G7. In fact, we've strengthened that advantage over the course of the pandemic, Madam Speaker. Our unemployment rate is also near its record low, and 500,000 more Canadians are working today than before the pandemic. We do appreciate, though, that this is a difficult time for families, friends, and of course our neighbors. That is why we are now moving forward with targeted measures, including new ones introduced in the Fall Economic Statement. For example, Bill C-32 would make the federal portion of all Canada student loans and Canada apprentice loans permanently become interest-free, including those that are currently being repaid. We are also continuing to implement our government's affordability plan, which includes targeted measures worth $12.1 billion. For example, Madam Speaker, with Bill C-31 having recently received royal assent, we are moving forward with the creation of the Canada Dental Benefit for children under 12 in families with annual incomes less than $90,000 who do not have access to a private dental plan. Also, individuals and families receiving the GST credit started receiving an additional $2.5 billion in support earlier this month, and I thank my friend opposite for supporting that measure. These are targeted measures that helps make life more affordable for Canadians who need it the most, while being careful not to add fuel to the inflationary fire. Now, when it comes to pollution pricing, we know that a national price on pollution is the most effective and least costly way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions while putting more money back into the pockets of most Canadians. Climate action is no longer a theoretical political debate, it is an economic necessity. Earlier this month, the Parliamentary Budget Officer published an analysis showing that climate change has and will continue to negatively impact the Canadian economy. Conservatives regularly conflate the increased cost in global commodity prices with the price on pollution, but this is a fundamental error in practice. In BC, for example, the carbon price has increased by only 2 cents per litre over the last 3 years, while the price of gas has increased by over $1. That means Conservatives are regularly ignoring 98% of the real problem. They also ignore the fact that the federal carbon price is revenue neutral and that it actually makes life more affordable for 8 out of 10 Canadian families through the Climate Action Rebate. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Well, I know that the first thing I asked for in this debate was for my colleague across the way to pull his head out of his Liberal notes and actually do some thinking on this, because a bunch of what he said is a bunch of, well, am I allowed to say malarkey in this House, Madam Speaker? In any event, let's go through the actual numbers and some of them that I'll have a few minutes to talk about. He talked about the G7. He talked about where Canada performs on a net debt basis. His numbers, his government's numbers, his speaking point narratives are far different than any other body in the world that actually measures we are economically in the world, including the IMF, who've just recently come out and ranked Canada far lower than his vaunted expectation of where this country is. And that's because some people know how to count. I don't think anybody on that side of the bench knows how to actually do the math on this. But if the G7 countries he talks about, Canada is the only G7 country that has not either reduced their carbon taxes because of inflation or done away with them completely. How did you respond to that? Thank you.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, you didn't hear it because I said it while he was speaking, but I take a lot of time writing these speeches, so I hope he likes all the effort that goes into this. Madam Speaker, our government has continued to reduce our debt to GDP ratio and has created over 500,000 new jobs since the pandemic. Our fiscally responsible plan has maintained our AAA credit rating and allows us to invest in Canadians while we fight global inflation. Those are independent ratings, Madam Speaker, done by independent experts, and I'll rely on those independent experts as opposed to some of the opinions by the member opposite, although I do respect his opinion. We're going to continue to focus on making life more affordable and growing an economy that works for everyone. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, and will ensure that Canadians remain in the best place in the world to live, to work, and to thrive. We're going to make sure that we make life better for future generations while we grow the economy and fight climate change at the same time. In fact, it's crucial that we do both, Madam Speaker.